Hi everyone, I'm Alice and today we're going to be looking at the causes of the Black Death. Okay, so we're going to have 4 things that we go through today. One of them is why did the Black Death spread so quickly when it came to Europe? What did people think caused the Black Death at the time, and then what actually caused it? And then finally, we're going to have a quick look at and a recap at why people were unable to find the real cause of the Black Death. Now, first of all, we're just going to have a look at what the Black Death actually was, if you've never heard of it before. And we're going to see how we can actually link it to our current day lives as well. So, just going to share my screen a second. Okay, so hopefully you should all be able to see the screen there. So we're going to have a look, first of all, at what the Black Death actually was. Now, at the top of your screen, there is a definition of the Black Death. Now, it says all the conditions were right for an epidemic. Now, an epidemic, the definition of an epidemic is when a disease breaks out over a certain geographical area. Okay, so in a certain area, in this case, Europe, a disease breaks out and it covers that entire area. Now, doctors were powerless against infectious disease. We're going to have a closer look at why that was in a second. So people were weakened by war and harvest failures. In times of war, the population suffers because food resources are going to soldiers. You lose quite a bit of the population, and it's a hard time for everyone to live during. And harvest failures, which meant that food was even more scarce. Okay, there was even less food. And you've got to think about in terms of illness and wellness. If you are famished, if you don't have very much food, then your immune system isn't going to be working as well. And that means that you are going to have less immunity to disease, and disease is going to spread more easily. So germs, the fleas which carried them and the rats which carried the fleas, flourished in the dirty towns. Now, you may have heard of when rats are around more, so your parents might tell you to never leave crumbs out, you might track rats. They didn't know then why rats were around, but there were a lot of rats and there were a lot of dirty towns. Busy trade routes, which we'll have a look at in a second, carried the plague from one place to another. So the plague arrived at Melcombe Regis in Dorset, which was a port town, in June 1348. Now, the plague was around until this main outbreak that we're going to focus on in the next couple of lessons. The main outbreak of the plague was around for 4 years. It was 1348 to 1352. But then what we actually got then was the plague coming again and again. And it had different nicknames through the different years. So it would come back every sort of 10 years or so. It never really went, but these big outbreaks. So we had them in the 1360s, in the 1370s. And each time it seemed to actually target a different group of people. So one, I think the 1360 ones was called the children's plague. Then there was one that affected mainly men. So it developed over time, but it did keep coming back. And actually the last main outbreak of the plague that we had in this country was in 1665, which you will know as the Great Plague when you go on to study that. And that mainly was in London. And what actually killed that was the Great Fire of London in 1666. So it's not just something that happened in the 1300s. We have it over a 300-year period. But the Black Death is what we're looking at in the mid 14th century, the 1300s. So it reached Wales, Ireland, and the north of England in 1349. And by 1350, it had made it to Scotland. And estimates suggest as much as half of the population died. That's obviously 1 in 2 people. That's a lot of people. And it has a massive, massive impact on life in England, which we'll look at in a couple of lessons' time. So it affected the way people thought about life in many different ways. Some lived lives perceived to be wild or immoral. So some people changed the way they lived. They might have started stealing. They might have done things that they wouldn't have done because they thought, well, I might die any second. while others fell into deep despair, and some chose to accept their fate and just thought, what is going to happen is going to happen. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is why the Black Death spread so rapidly. So we mentioned trade quite briefly at the beginning. Now, if we have a look at this map, and we are going to come back to the second map in the next lesson, but this shows you medieval trade routes. Now, this is a map of Europe, and you can see here how all of every orange line is a trade route, and it shows you where the main routes are. The thicker the line is, the more traffic there was in that area. Now, you can see how we're leaving Spain, for example, and going to France, and then going to England and going to Germany. A lot around Italy, with a lot of trade between Italy and France in this thick area here. And if we compare that then to the spread of the Black Death in January to June 1348, if you compare those two maps, what you can actually see is a lot of these lines are the same. A lot of the areas that the people were trading, the Black Death spread across quite quickly. And the reason that was because there was a lot of movement of people. So if you imagine a disease was to start up in Ypres, up here in France and Belgium, in this area, and if you look at this main trade route down here, and you can see Milan in Italy down here, the amount of traffic going backwards and forwards means that disease can spread very, very quickly. Okay, and this is a new thing we have in this time period, in the Tudor time, sorry, not the Tudor times, in the Middle Ages, we have a lot of trade. It's not like people are just staying in their own village, because if you imagine if somebody had got the Black Death in their own village and they'd only stayed in there, they may have infected and killed the people in their village, but that would have been it. Okay, and that's not the case, because people are moving around, they're spreading so much. Now, I did mention that we're going to have a look at how we can relate this to life today. Now, we are living during a global pandemic. Okay, it's still going on at the time of recording of COVID. And the reason that we've had these lockdowns, the first lockdown in March 2020, and then we have one in Christmas 2020, and these lockdowns keep happening, is that idea is that we know now, which they didn't know then, is to contain an illness, you need to keep people where they are. Okay, and the reason is if you had the Black Death or COVID and you were to go out and spread it around, then that person might travel somewhere else, and it's just going to take it to more places. So that's why we've had those lockdowns. Now, they didn't know that at this time. They didn't know that they were taking this disease around, and therefore it just spread really, really quickly. Okay, so we've got trade routes then. Let's just make a note of these reasons we've got for the Black Death spreading so quickly. So number one that we've just talked about is trade routes. Number two, we're going to have a talk about is hygiene. Now, hygiene, again, really, really high on our radar at the moment. You may have noticed, hopefully, that everywhere you go, you've got to wear, well, not anymore, but you did have to wear a face mask. You had to use hand sanitizer, wash your hands for 20 seconds all the time, like more often than we would have done in the past. Going into shopping centres, for example, if you went to Tesco, somebody was making sure that you were cleaning your trolley. And that is to stop the spread of disease. So it's to kill the bacteria on your hands, making sure that if you have any of the infection in your mouth, you're not spreading it by breathing on other people, which is why we had face masks. Now, hygiene didn't exist during the Middle Ages because they just didn't know about disease. They didn't know about bacteria, and that these were living things that could be transmitted. They had absolutely no idea of what was going on. So hygiene was really, really poor. People didn't have access to running water. They definitely didn't have access to soap, definitely not hand sanitizer. Okay, so the conditions were rife for disease to spread because hygiene was just basically non-existent. The other thing that we have here is lack of knowledge. Okay, and knowledge here that we're talking about is medical knowledge. Okay, so the doctors, like I've just said, didn't know what bacteria was. They didn't know what was causing the Black Death. Therefore, they didn't know how to treat it. They didn't know that a lockdown might have helped. They didn't know that asking people to wash their hands if they could might have helped. People just went about their everyday lives just in fear that the Black Death might strike them. And they did know that if they caught it, the people within their household would have been likely to catch it as well. They were aware that you did catch it, but they didn't have any idea of the science behind it. Once you had the Black Death, it was not 100% of the time, but more often than not, a death sentence. And people tended to die within the week if they had the Black Death. They didn't know how to treat it because they didn't know what caused it. Okay, so that's another reason that it spread so quickly. And then another one that's linked to hygiene is fleas. Okay, fleas and rodents. There were a lot of rats around, which we'll have another talk about in a second. There were a lot of rats around. There were a lot of fleas, and the fleas actually carried the bacteria that spread the Black Death. Okay, so we've got four main reasons there. To recap them, we've got trade routes, we've got hygiene, the lack of hygiene, lack of medical knowledge to be able to prevent it or treat it, and then we had fleas. So if you think about all the things that we know today and why we've been able to an extent contain COVID, and it's not just gone through the entire population, it's because we've got a better sense of hygiene and we know what's causing this disease and how we can sort of try and prevent it from spreading, which they didn't have any of during the time of the Black Death. Okay, and we can see here an example. We can see here an example. You can see there's a dead body in the street there. There's dead animals in the street there. There's people in bed with the Black Death, very, very close. So when people died from it, they didn't bury them straight away, and therefore the disease was lingering around. When they did bury them, they didn't bury them deep enough to get rid of the disease. So there was a lot going on that meant that this could spread really, really quickly. Okay, so people at the time, what did they think caused the Black Death? Because they didn't know what did cause it. The causes that they had, or they thought, well, this might be what's causing it, so let's keep an eye on these things. Number one was the planets. Okay, they thought the alignment of the planets might be something that was causing it. So if one planet was in the wrong place compared to another planet, that might be causing the Black Death. Now, obviously, nowadays, we know these things not to be true, but let's remember they had absolutely no medical knowledge at this time. The second thing that they thought it might be was a punishment from God. Okay, so we will have a look at some of the cures for the Black Death in a later session. But what some people did do was trying to punish themselves. So they would get a whip and whip their backs, as like saying, look, God, I might have done something wrong, but look, I'm punishing myself. You don't need to punish me. Please don't give me the Black Death. Okay, so different things like that. They might try to ward off God, to say, look, I'm really sorry. Please don't come and get me. So they thought it might be a punishment from God for some of their sins. Another one, which was really big for a lot of the illnesses, they thought this caused a lot of illnesses in the Middle Ages. It was miasma, and miasma means bad air. Okay, so one of the ways that they would try and again ward off the Black Death was by carrying something that smells sweet around with them. So they would sniff this sweet smelling things and hopefully get rid of these bad airs and these bad smells. Okay, so they thought a bad smell. Now, they may not have been too far off with the bad smell, because a bad smell may have meant that there was bacteria around or something that was foul and causing disease, but they didn't know that. They thought it was just the bad air. Strangers, people became very wary of each other, and they thought that a stranger might bring it with them, which they very well could have done. They thought that might have been a cause of it. Another thing that we will see cropping up a lot, or you'll see quite cropping up a lot in your history lessons, is this idea of using the Jewish community as a scapegoat, okay, so blaming a minority in society for something going wrong. And what a lot of people actually thought during this time was it was the Jews poisoning the wells, the drinking wells. So they actually killed a lot of Jewish people during this time to try and get rid of the Black Death. What the Christians didn't note, though, was there were as many Jewish people dying from it as Christian people, but they did suspect the Jews poisoning the wells as one of the causes. And then we go on to have a look at a more far-fetched one, which is wearing pointed shoes. They thought that might be a cause of Black Death. If you were walking around in shoes that were pointed, that might bring you some bad luck and be a cause of the Black Death for you. Okay, so some of these we can see that there may be some logic behind it, such as the bad air and strangers. Somebody you don't know coming into your town may well be bringing the Black Death. Bad air, bad smells, may be bringing it, but not for the reason that they thought. The other things, they really were clutching at straws, okay? They were trying to think, what could it be? Because if I get this right, I could prevent myself from getting it, okay? And with, as we said, with the God thing, if they thought it was coming from God, they could say, look, God, this is me doing something. Please don't punish me, okay? But things like wearing pointed shoes, we can really see there that they really didn't know where they were coming from. Okay, so the third thing we're going to have a look at is what actually caused the Black Death. Okay, now this might be an area that you might want to have a look at in a bit more detail by yourselves after this session, because there has recently been things in the news around this. Okay, so what the Black Death was actually caused by was a bacteria, or a bacterium. Now, I don't want you to worry about the Black Death. We've got enough to worry about at the moment, health-wise. What we know now is that it is a bacteria, and we could now treat it with antibiotics. Okay, you may hear in the news every couple of years, maybe more than that, less frequently than that, that there is an outbreak of the Black Death. In Madagascar, it tends to come up quite often in Madagascar. It's not, fingers crossed, going to become a global pandemic, because we can treat it with antibiotics nowadays. We have the medical knowledge to stop this becoming such a deadly disease. So it's not something that we need to be worrying about. This disease, now, if you have a look at this little infographic down here, we've got number 1. The rat carries the plague bacteria. Actually, the flea on the rat carries the plague bacteria. The flea drinks the rat's blood. The bacteria multiplies in the flea's abdomen. The flea bites the human, and the human is infected. Now, what these recent studies have actually shown is that the rat has got a lot of bad press for this, when it might not actually have been his fault. And what the recent studies have shown, and the way that they've done this, it's a really cool thing to watch, is they've mapped the spread of the Black Death. And it said if the disease was carried by rats, it would have spread like this, and it would have spread this quickly. If it was spread by humans, it would have looked like this, and it would have spread this quickly. And what they actually found was the disease being spread by humans matched what actually happened, rather than it being spread by rats. So it was actually more likely to be fleas on humans that were then jumping from human to human and infecting each other, rather than the rat carrying, the rat would have started it, because obviously, as we can see here, the rat carries the plague bacteria, then it drinks, the blood is drunk by the flea. But then once that is in the human, it jumps from human to human, and the rat might not have actually had as much to do with it as we first thought. So that might be something interesting for you to go off and have a look at. Okay, so they are the causes of the Black Death. Now, it spread very, very quickly, and that's something we're going to have a look at in more detail in the next session, how it spread and who brought it in the first place, and where it sort of developed and went on to. So we've got different reasons. Just to recap one more time, it spread so rapidly, followed by what people thought caused it at the time, some which were plausible, some which were not, and then what actually caused the Black Death, which was this bacterium, and it being transmitted either by rats or by humans. Okay, so hopefully you found that useful. I will pop some questions on the end of the next session just to make you have a look back at what we've done and sort of round up this session and the next one. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, as I've said, that's been of some help to you, and good luck with all of your studies, and I'll see you for the next video.